Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeff.
Stop
yeah.
What a sharing now. So
what a rich and substantial look at corpus-based approaches, and those examples, pulled out really nice examples there. I think there's lots of room for discussion. So I'd like to welcome participants to submit your questions. You can either raise your hand, and if you're able to put on your video, that's nice too. Raise your hand, or you can submit your questions in the chat, and then I can read them if that's what you'd prefer. So while we're waiting for the questions to roll in, Jeff, I had a question. You said that the WOA corpora are based on spontaneous speech, and I wondered what you meant by spontaneous speech, because I'm thinking of the Khamsari text, and it's they're folk tales. It's a very formal genre. So what do you mean by spontaneous?
Okay, thanks, Eric. Yeah, that's a very good question. So spontaneous means unscripted, in the sense that a person delivers speech without having something to work off, like a script. But of course, there's degrees of spontaneity. And you're right. I mean, a lot of these texts, not all of them, but a lot of them are folk tales. And so you might say, well, there's a lot of formulaic language in there. There's a lot of prefabricated chunks and so on. And maybe there is, maybe more so in Khamsari, I'm not sure. But I can only say this for having worked with, because I sort of started with Kurdish working on this stuff, Mackenzie stuff, which is a lot of folk tales. And the people that were speaking for him back in the 50s were real storytellers, you know, the people trained in the tradition. And there aren't many people like that. But anyway, what I found is that actually the syntax at this level, so things like word order, isn't really significantly different to what people say anyway. So I'm not ruling out that there is effects of, you know, prefabricated stuff being in there, but I found that for what we're looking at here, they're not great. There are for other things. So I can tell you this, the work that I've done with Mariam Norzai on definiteness marking, which in Baluchi, we found big differences actually in the way that the definiteness suffix, or what we call the evaluative suffix, that varies an awful lot according to genre, but word order, I don't think does. So you're completely right. I mean, in principle, it's a problem, but the practice that I've had at least is that the sort of more abstract word order rules, which speakers are usually not very aware of, they don't vary significantly to what you get in conversational language. So yeah. But spontaneous simply means spoken without being scripted, and you know, they're not translating. But I do have to say they're mostly not conversational. So that's an important point. The reason being that annotating conversational data is just too much work.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the big difference being between the scripted or the idealized representations of what people think a typical sentence is versus what anyone would say in a longer text. That's where they really cluster together in a natural way. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's an important point. Thank you.
Okay. So we've got several people have raised their hand. Annetta, would you start us off with your question? Thanks.
Hey, thank you for this really inspiring talk. So this was nice. I have a question concerning your concept of geography. I'm not sure I quite understand it yet. As I understand it, it's partly about language contact and partly about isolation, and probably some of the things might be replicable if you look at thinking about this Gagauz thing. So part of the effect might be due to language contact, okay, with other language groups such as Slavic or Romance even maybe, and so of course, this is the case with other Turkic languages also. And I was thinking about Karaim for a minute, and yes, maybe one could observe similar things, but it's also isolated and it's also Slavic contact. But yeah, so calling this geography, okay, yeah. So my question is about this concept. Can you make this? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the term geography may not be the best term. That's true. I could say location. The point is this: the structure of a language comes from two possible sources. One is from the history, basically what the parents and the parents' parents and the parents' parents' parents spoke, and what they transmitted down to their children. And that's sort of what we think is regular language change. But it can also be the case that your language is not just a product of what your parents spoke, but also what the kids you played in the street with, or the people you met at the market, or the people you interact with during your perhaps formative years in childhood, or the fact that you actually speak 3 languages and you sometimes mix them and so on. So, so that second type of influence is primarily a question of where you are. Whereas the first one is just where do you come from, or where your parents come from. So this is what I mean by geography. But you're right, there are 2 separate aspects to this, and that's why it's very hard to quantify geography. One is how close is it to, let's say, the epicenter of another language, okay? So how close, you know, what other languages are spoken nearby. And the other is how isolated is it from its relatives? So this is the outlier effect. And this actually seems to be very powerful. It's not just about contact with other languages, it's also about lack of contact with your own related languages. So the 2 sort of go together, but they're not very easy to weight. You know, how would you quantify this and put it into the model? And we're really struggling with it, actually, but we're not the only ones. So for example, if you had to, so each of our locations gets a coordinate on a map, right? And what do? Well, we basically make a rough estimate of where we think, you know, where the speaker was socialized. But for big languages, I mean, what's the coordinate you'd put for Persian? I mean, you can't say it's Tehran, surely, and that just doesn't make sense. So for some of these languages which are spoken in one village, it's pretty easy, but for a language that's spoken across a large region, it becomes very difficult to quantify place and distance as well. I mean, the case of Kumzari is wonderful. Kumzari is actually not that far as the crow flies from the rest of Iranian, but of course there's a body of water in between it. And you have to take all that into account. So one way that we've been doing it is Google Maps walking distances, which is quite a nice way of doing it. But you know, it's really turned out to be quite a complicated thing, and everybody struggles with it. I guess the larger the scale that you're looking at, the easier it becomes. And you know, most of the people doing this end up working with crowfly distances because at the level of thousands of kilometers, it's maybe not so important whether there's a body of water or a mountain range or something. The effects will still come out. But it's, yeah, so that's a little bit about this thing of geography. So it's,
and so Jeff, when you have various Persian texts, do you give the geographic coordinates for the speaker who gave that text, or do you have a single coordinate for Persian, for example?
Yeah, that's a problem, and Persian is a problem. And I think the current state is simply, and I'm ashamed to admit this, I think the Persian corpus dot, there's 2 options. Either it's Hamadan, where a lot of the speakers come from and where we did recordings, but not all the speakers in the corpus come from Hamadan, or it's Tehran, simply because what else were we going to do? But there's no, strictly speaking, this is the thing, you see, if you had a corpus from one speaker, then it would be easier. And I would do exactly what you say. I would take the place of socialization of that speaker. But then some of the corpora, we have texts from different speakers. That's not a big problem if it's a small language because they're not too far apart, but for big languages, it can be a problem. So yeah, with the large languages, the whole issue of how you're going to evaluate space becomes complicated. And I think for some things, we just leave Persian out.
Yeah. Okay. Seema, you had a question.
Yes. Hello, and thank you, Jeff. It's nice to see you.
Seema. Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah, for such a long time. And as always, it was very inspiring. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning of your talk because of technical problem. Did you explain the reason behind choosing this specific languages in your corpus? And I have another question about Persian. You know, the huge gap between spoken and non-spoken Persian. Have you noticed the same difference in other Iranian? I know that for Semitic and Turkic languages there is a difference, but for other Iranian languages, and how that can affect our linguistic analysis and this real language that people speak and the text and like the reading stuff that are really non-heard. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Simin. So yeah, let me go to the first question, which was how we chose the languages. So WOWA stands for word order in Western Asia, and that says basically why we chose the language. So we're looking at Western Asia, which essentially corresponds to West Iran, North Iraq, a sort of little southern strip of the Caucasus, and Eastern Turkey. The reason we chose that area is because it is a transition zone between a typologically fairly consistent area to the north and the east, and another typologically consistent zone, but with opposite values to the west. So it's an overlap. This was actually the driving rationale behind the choice of the region, and that choice of the region dictated the choice of languages. So any language spoken in that area is potentially interesting for us, and that's why we look at Neo-Aramaic and Turkic. We also have Georgian, Armenian. The biggest language group in that region is Iranian. So most of the languages that we have are Iranian. So and it's also a matter of convenience. I mean, we're happy to take anything we can get basically that's from that region, because, you need texts that are reliable, that you think, yeah, this is genuine language. Ideally, you want the recordings. You want a transcription and some analysis so that you can work with it. And we're very happy to take whatever we can find. So luckily in the last 10, 20 years, a lot of language documentation has been done. So Baluchi, for example, we've got rich documentations of different varieties, which have been great to be used for this project. For Neo-Aramaic, they've done an amazing job. So we take whatever we can get from the region. Now, the second question, what about spoken and written? Well, most of these languages are unwritten. They don't have an indigenous writing tradition. So they haven't had the time, if you like, to develop particular written registers. I mean, Persian we know is a very special case. I mean, we have a huge length of written tradition and hugely prestigious. And I mean, it's just, I mean, Persian poetry and the written tradition is monumental. And then we've got what people speak, and there's, as you say, a big gap. That's why we've done Hambam, because we wanted to get away from the written word.
Actually, my question was about spoken, like in Persian, even in a spoken, we have different levels, like formal spoken, non-formal spoken. And I make a distinction between spoken and non-spoken because nowadays we even write the spoken Persian. But this difference, like a Kurdish person or a Baluchi person, when he is talking to an elderly or higher status, the language is the same basically. I mean, they won't use plural verbs for showing respect or formality. I mean, I'm looking for these aspects, not the only show of way of showing respect in other Iranian languages, as far as I know, is to the choice of words, like adding a title or an adjective or something, but not any structural difference. Have you noticed any of them? Yeah. So.
Okay, so yeah, you're right with Persian. Of course, there is a range of formality in the spoken language. We have in the Hambam corpus also a range of different levels of spoken formality. So there's things like radio interviews and podcasts. Now it's pretty spontaneous. It's not people reading, but they're obviously more formal than the bit I played, which was just a mother actually telling her children some stories about the childhood in a very sort of, an environment of intimates and talking among themselves. So yeah, there's different levels of formality there. My impression is, but I can't speak for all the languages in there. I mean, there's 25, 30 languages in there, and I really don't know enough about them. Probably there are these degrees too, and we may be missing some of it. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's an important point about, can one quantify formality of registers, and then that would interact with the big data, but it's so hard to do. It's like geography. It's almost infinitely complex, but so important. Sahar, you had your hand up earlier. Do you still have a question, or has Jeff answered it?
Kind of, but not completely. I was actually not sure to bring up this question because it was not the main concern of Dr. Haig's presentation, but thank you for calling me. I would prefer now to bring it up in case Dr. Haig, you have some thoughts about it. By the way, thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I was thinking of the word ordering in the clausal level in sentences, particularly with respect to the ordering of the direct object and the verb, where we see more variation. For example, as you noted yourself, when the object is a pronoun, we have a strict ordering as the object has to be, we have a more free or flexible ordering as it can either precede the verb or follow it. By contrast, when we have an overt nominal, we have to get the object in the preverbal position. And I was thinking of, based on my linguistic impressions, totally based on an impressionistic judgment, and mostly based on Persian and Kurdish, because these are the languages that I know most about. When we see the word ordering in the clausal level, we see such types of variations, but when we compare other domains, such as, for example, prepositions or possessive phrases, we see a more strict ordering, such that we don't see such displacement in those domains. For example, Persian never allows the possessor to be, for example, in a prenominal position, and in the prepositions we have the strict ordering. I was thinking if you have found in your data such negative correlations, and if you have any explanations or thoughts about such inconsistencies.
Okay, thank you very much. That is actually pretty well what I spend most of my time doing. So thanks. I'll try to be brief, but yeah, those are the things that do interest me. So the first question, there's a general principle across all the languages we've looked at, and I think it's probably universal. The degree of variation tends to be smaller when you get down into noun phrases or determiner phrases. This is well known. And Natalia Levshina has done a lovely paper on this, showing she measures it using a measurement called entropy, and cross-linguistically it works pretty clearly. So for example, just to take the extreme case, take a determiner like the English article and a noun, it's pretty near impossible to shift that determiner behind the noun, right? I mean, it's just so bad that you just, whatever you do, you're not going to say house there. But, you can move an adverb like this morning quite freely, like this morning I ran 5 miles, or I ran 5 miles this morning, no problem, right? So, there's huge differences in the mobility of different constituents, and roughly speaking, it has a little bit to do with size and weight. Determiners are quite small, and they tend to be prosodically dependent on something, so their position is a bit more fixed, whereas an adverbial clause is quite a complex thing, and you can move it around a bit. So there's a correlation like that, but it's also probably structurally driven as well. So yeah, that's true. We get more variation with verbal arguments than we do in sub-NP constituents as a general rule. What doesn't quite fit though is this adpositional stuff, which is so messy. And the thing about the variation there though is it's not that you can take one noun and add position and have it in different places. It's that the different types of adposition, so preposition and postposition, are tied to very specific contexts and have very specific meanings. And you can't just take the preposition and move it, but you might have a postposition with a different context and so on. So that's a different type of variation. So yeah, there is a correlation there with smaller units having greater greater fixation, as it were. And I'm not sure, the last question about the pronouns. Yeah, this is a part of a bigger thing, actually. This is really a very fascinating thing. Generally, the most mobile objects across all our corpora are definite. Okay, so there's something going on with information structure here. So, and this is famous for Persian too. The Frommer in his 1981 dissertation already showed that the only types of direct object that could be postposed were ones that were marked with Ra. It doesn't mean all the Ra ones are postposed, but the ones that are postposed are with a very high level of frequency. They're marked with Ra, which presumably also has something to do with some level of information structure. And we found this because we've coded for definiteness. The definite direct objects tend to be more mobile. And that's the same for Semitic languages, which are VO, and for Turkic and Iranian, which are OV. So the definite ones are a bit freer to move to the other side of the verb. And that would have also perhaps some explanatory appeal for the pronouns, okay? Because they're obviously definite. That's what I can say at the moment. We're still working on it. It also has an effect with case marking as well, but we're not quite there yet. But yeah, there's a lot of very interesting structural correlations there.
Thanks so much.
And traditional typological analysis was very good at these yes or no questions and very good at the fixed structures. But corpus-based typology, as Jeff shown, it helps us to handle the gradient cases. So Arsalan, your hand's been up for a while. You had said I could wait to call on you. I wasn't ignoring you. And so I wondered if you could, you had a question, and then Ms. Zahra Etabari also had a question. Could you ask both those questions of Jeff, please?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I said I can go last, but anyway, I'll go now. So the question from Zahra Tebari, which was also one of my questions, is about the order of the objects and the verb. So when you gave the order, you talked about pronouns being more flexible, but you didn't clarify whether those are clitics or strong pronouns. I think that probably makes it.
Yeah, they're strong pronouns. They shouldn't be clitics. The clitics should have been left out of that. But annotators might not have been clear on it, so that might be a thing. But it's intended to be the non-clitic pronouns. That's
because that would make a big difference for Persian.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So that's really great. And by the way, thank you, Jeff, for the great talk. Now I'm going to ask my own question, which is, I'm sure it's something you've heard, but one of the issues that people can raise about this kind of like corpus-based work is that it sort of glosses over the differences, structural differences that you might have. So I'll take one example, which you actually talked about, which is I said to you, right? So if you look at that and you look at a language like Persian, like present day Persian, what you get is a prepositional phrase like I to him said, basically something like that. And then you would think, okay, like here's another language, actually classical Persian, which you would say man u ra goftam, where you would get actually the object with a raw marked object. Now you could take the raw to be postpositional. It is something, it's a marker, it's debatable, but potentially you could do that. And you would end up with the conclusion that, oh, this language has postpositions, whereas the other language has a preposition, whereas the real difference is the argument structure of the verb that is different between the two variants, right? Like in one case we have tell that takes a direct object, and the other one takes an indirect object. So like, how do you address this concern of people who, have that issue with this type of, typological work?
Well, yeah, thanks. It's really, there are so many problems with corpus-based typology. I'm really amazed that I get away with this. So I'm really glad that I just sort of, I'm aware of the problems. And this is the one you mentioned, actually, because in that case, so if you choose nominally the same lexical verb, and at the level of comparing different varieties, we're looking for a translational equivalent of a sentence. I said to him, or I told him this. Now, if they turned out to have underlyingly at some level different argument structure, then obviously we're going to miss that. But the only way to control for it is to use, let's say, the same object. So let's say a pronoun him, and the translational equivalent of whatever language we're using. That may, we could get into all sorts of trouble if we were using things like see and look at or something like that, obviously. But the bottom line is translational equivalent. And I think actually that's what most people do when they're dealing with language. They don't know that well anyway, right? I mean, if you're eliciting a sentence, you give them an English sentence and they give you something back, and you hope that, and then you go to another language and give them the same sentence and you get something back, and you assume that basically it's the same argument structure because it's giving you the same content. So really deep and fine distinctions we're going to miss, obviously. That's one thing. With the Persian one, I don't know. I mean, can't you also argue that raw marked indirect objects at earlier stages of Persian, and then you don't have to change the argument structure of Goftan?
Raw is marking direct objects, but in present day,
in indirect. I mean, at an earlier stage, Ra would have marked indirect objects. This is part of the history of Ra.
Yeah, possibly you could say that, but also, like, I mean, you would have to see if this is done more widely. But I think the verb tell in particular, cross-linguistically, does have that distinction of, like, in some language, let's say English, you would say I told him and not I told to him. but in other languages like Persian, you have, it takes a PP. So I think, I mean, that was just an example. In general, this kind of generalization, which looks at, a lot of data, it could potentially, I think it does miss, the fine-grained differences that could be there. So structurally, like, there could be a difference between the two cases that translation actually would be the same. But even the examples that I saw with the Kirghiz, they were raw marked. I mean, again, you could say that raw is just a P like any other P for those languages. I would have a hard time accepting that, but especially for present day languages that do mark, like Persian, that do mark direct objects with the raw. But, it was just an example to show this bigger issue, yeah.
I think about Google Translate, and which has bypassed underlying structure and just looked at probability of combinations, and it's a much better translation tool than any of the smart tools that were sensitive to argument structure. And I wonder if that's what corpus-based analysis can give us, even though we know it's bypassing the important deep elements of structure. Still, it gives us a different picture that the other kind of analysis can't. So, Geoffrey, you had your hand up, please.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Jeff. Good to see you.
Hi, Jeff. It's so good to see you after such a long time. Thank you so much for this stimulating, insightful, really very deep presentation for me. So not being a theoretical linguist, but I can relate to it a lot, especially when you talk about geography, language, contact, somebody else mentioned. I can relate to these things, and especially some of the Kurdish examples. And while you were presenting these great data, I was thinking of other examples that how some, for example, in the Sanandaj area, how this direct object construction has gone closer as you go to the south towards Persian versus Mahabad and Mukri Kurdish, which really deviates from that. And this is one of the major differences between the two. Well, differences anyway. But so thank you. But one thing really, I just wanted to make a comment. I don't have any question for you. I just wanted to make a comment that I think Seema made. The idea that there is written Persian and then spoken Persian, but then within spoken Persian, there are different registers. If I use Holiday's terminology, the level of formality, informality. But I think Seema also implied or directly said, languages like Baluchi or Kurdish doesn't have this variation. This is absolutely not true. And this is something I'm very sensitive to as a sociolinguist who works in this area. There is absolutely, in every single Kurdish region you go, there are different levels of formality. I grew up, for example, that's why my last name is Sheikhul Islami. I grew up in a religious, to some extent, but also landowners kind of type feudal family background. Until my dad died 4 years ago, I could never tell him to or ato. It was always you, thou as the plural formality. And I'm from Mahabad, from the Kurdish region. So class differences, class language variation based on class, based on gender, based on level of education, all of the things that we know from Lebov and all of the other great sociolinguists that they have discovered these different variations in different languages, it does exist in Kurdish as well. I don't know Baluchi, but I will be surprised if it doesn't exist in Baluchi as well. So for example, with written language, often the impression in Iran, because overall linguistic awareness of any other language besides Persian is so limited, unfortunately, because of the education system and everything else that we know, then there is this impression there is one Kurdish. No, there are tons of Kurdishes. And then when it comes to, for example, Central Kurdish, or better known as Sorani, the written Sorani, the standardized Sorani that is used today in Kurdish media in Iraqi Kurdistan, for example, or even at the University of Kurdistan in Sanandaj, is very, very drastically different from the spoken colloquial Kurdish on the street. It's very different, although the standardization only has taken place in several decades rather than Persian, which has a much longer history. But still, the differences are there. I just wanted to mention this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Just let me respond to that for a moment. I think that, yeah, look, I'm not really qualified to talk about registered differences across, all the languages that we look at. But obviously, you're correct that there's a repertoire of different registers. I guess the empirical question for me, though, is which aspects of linguistic structure are most susceptible. So obviously the choice of words is a big one, right? They're just words you don't use in some contexts and with some people. Choice of pronouns you mentioned, so to or eto, no go for certain contexts. Phonology, there's ways of pronouncing things which are highly, highly sensitive. So Lebov talks about the threshold of consciousness among linguistic markers. And Lebov doesn't talk much about syntax. That's, I think, because syntax is below that threshold, a lot of it anyway. So I'm that's why we keep to some fairly crude syntax. It's not that I don't like more complicated syntax, but I can't do it across, 25 languages. But yeah, I didn't want to mean to suggest that, we can just ignore it totally. I just hope that we're looking at features that are less graded according to register than other parts of the language.
Yeah, and so that underlines the importance, even for relatively newly standardized languages like Kurdish, the fact that we are depending on oral corpora. It's an important complement to what people say the grammar of Kurdish is. So everyone's staying on. This is like everyone's hanging on to the discussion. I think I'd like to limit it to the two hands that we have raised at this point. So Mr. Sadeghi and then Mr. Ariai, I welcome you to ask your questions, and then we'll probably close the session soon.
Hello there, everybody. I'd like to talk about the map you mentioned from Manchester database about the Kurdish region and its dialects and the characteristics of every dialect. You mentioned that each dialects have properties according to their region, according to the language near them. You analyze it and you describe it very well. But this is one dimension, and the other dimension of analyzing the language and dialects is their genetic sources. Does typology describe genetic and their genetic source of each dialects in the area?
Well, thanks for your question. If you use the term genetic in the sense of historical linguistics, then it's a little bit difficult. I mean, so what that means is how much shared history does a particular dialect have, or variety, with some other variety, okay? So at what point in time, so if we take two dialects and we compare them, we can sort of figure out roughly whether they split recently or whether the split happened a long time ago, in which case certain differences are likely to be larger. That's the sort of core business of historical linguistics, not so much typology really, but typology should control for that. The problem, of course, with a database of Kurdish is, well, everything's pretty close, especially, within Northern Kurdish. And so it would be hard to start using too much historical linguistic the sort of machinery of historical linguistics to figure out genetic relationships between dialects, because the time depth is just not enough to generate big differences. So, so the very fact that dialects are different tells us that they split at some time in the past, but we can't say much about when, because, you know, we're dealing with two small differences. So I'm not sure. Genetics in terms of human genomes, I don't know if that's what you meant, but I don't think we would want to say, I don't think we'd be able to relate that to the kind of differences at this level anyway. So I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's what I would think about.
Thank you. That's I asked this question because in generative framework, we can analyze the historical and the genetic relationship of language or dialects according to Baker and Longobardi's in PCM, in parametric comparison. We can trace back the origin of language, but I didn't know about the typology. And just one more question. According to the map, you consider, I think you consider the Zazaki a dialects of Kurdish. Am I right?
So that was...
Sorry, that depends on the map we're talking about. So the map from the Manchester database doesn't include Zaza.
Do you have any idea about it?
Yeah, but I don't think we want to go there.
I think, Jeff, it's the map that looks like Hasanpur's, and then Ergin worked it out. And I think that's the one, the black and white one that includes Zazaki and Gorani as but Kurdish dialect groups.
Okay, so...
Yeah.
Okay, but I didn't use that map. I only used the one straight out of the Manchester database, which doesn't...
I think I saw it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, but we won't solve classification of Kurdish at this session.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
That's for next week.
Yeah.
Or next session.
Next month.
And then, thank you. And then Mr. Aryai, your question.
Hey, Dr. Haig, thank you. I hope that you can hear me well.
Yeah, please. Yeah, that's great.
Great. Thanks for the talk. Just echoing very briefly what everybody said. This is fantastic. I just have a very quick minor question about, I think it was slide 18 or 19, where you showed the graph and the three variables across each language or dialect about, I think it was about pro drop level, the percentages. My question in this regard is that I'm very curious about it. It is really fascinating. So my question is that whether the differences that we see within each language or dialect are statistically significant, whether they are significant statistically across languages and dialects. And if so, what do they tell us? If not, whether we can use these statistical tools in order to make sense out of it in order to be able to classify these languages or dialects properties.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I've left all that out. The question of, so when you get a data set like this, then you got the data set. What you do with it then becomes a question of statistics. And that's basically, there's no limit. What model you're going to use, what tests you're going to use, what parameters you want to spend, and so on. The sky's the limit, okay? As far as simple significance testing goes, that would be relatively straightforward to do on those numbers. Because at least for the subjects, because the token numbers are quite high. For the objects, it wouldn't really work well because the token numbers for first and second person are pretty low, and you'd have to do all sorts of fancy stuff to get more leverage out of them. But really, what you can do with the statistical modeling is the sky's the limit. And nowadays, I don't think anybody would want just a pairwise significance test, they would want to do a much more sophisticated model. And I worked then with statisticians and say, here's my data, and we want to know this and this and this, and that's how it goes. So, but when you get a trend like the one for objects across 15 languages from all over the world, actually, that is so striking. I would be very surprised if it didn't reach a level of significance. But, you know, that's just, there's too much coincidence going on there. You would expect a random spread, and the number of tokens in each of those corpora is in the several hundreds. So I would be reasonably confident that whatever you did with it, you would come out with a reasonably strong signal. But you're completely right. But that is that's the next stage. I mean, corpus-based typology is really, what I've shown here is how to get the figures out, and stage 2 is how to interpret it. And then it's all statistics. That's it. I mean, it's just either you have to learn statistics or you have to work with people that know what they're doing. And yeah, that's where you end up.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so we're coming in on just under 2 hours, and the fact that not one participant dropped out during this extended discussion period, I think is a testament to how engaging and meaningful the topic is. So Jeff, again, I want to thank you for joining us for this 4th talk of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali lecture series based out of U of Toronto and with Carleton. And it was a great pleasure to have you here today. To our guests, I want to thank you for coming. And I wish you good luck until next time. And then 1 month from now, we'll have Professor Shehol Eslami and me. You'll have a chance to hear us talking about mapping Kurdish, if that's something you're interested in as well. So, Ruzu khubi dashte bashid. Thank you so much for joining us. Khudafez.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Eric, and the organizers
Thank
again.
you.
It was a real pleasure, and thanks to the audience for a really good discussion.
Thank you so
Real
much.
pleasure.